Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Tony Accardo, the man who rose from the streets of Chicago to become one of the most respected and enduring figures in organized power, known for his discipline, intelligence, and quiet leadership. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Tony Accardo guide you into the night. He was born in Chicago in 1906 to Sicilian immigrants who knew long days and short pay. The family lived in tight rooms on the near west side, where church bells, street vendors, and factory whistles marked the hours. The neighborhood carried the scent of fresh bread, coal smoke, and wet newsprint. Children ran errands. Mothers kept households together. Fathers took whatever work showed up. Tony attended school, then slipped out of it before high school. The city taught quicker lessons. He sold papers, handled small jobs in shops, and watched older boys who had newer shoes and full pockets. Those boys belonged to corner crews that gathered in cafes along Halsted. The Circus Cafe had a crowd that mattered, a crew that handled errands for bigger men. Tony joined them as a teenager. It started with driving and lookouts, the simple chores that prove reliability. He kept his voice low, obeyed orders, and absorbed the rules. The first rule was don't bring attention. The second was don't speak names. The third was don't forget who pays, who protects, and who expects results on time. Early Prohibition turned the neighborhood into a marketplace with no labels. Beer moved in trucks, whiskey moved in crates, and cash moved in satchels. The Circus Cafe crowd linked up with the leaders who were organizing routes, payoffs, and meeting spots. They noticed the kid who stayed out of tavern arguments and never missed a shift. He learned roads, crossed city limits at night, and returned before dawn. When Al Capone's name filled every column, the city felt like a stage lit by flashes. Tony kept off stage. He found work as a driver, and later as a bodyguard moving behind the larger figures. Journalists later tied him to enforcement work, collection runs, and supervision over houses that ran games behind closed doors. He dressed formally even in summer, kept his hair neat, and avoided clubs where cameramen waited. A story traveled through the decades that Capone once called him Joe Batters, a compliment wrapped in a nickname for carrying out brutal orders. The exact circumstances remain disputed, and not for retelling here. The detail that matters is that the label stuck and the reputation hardened. He completed assignments without noise and without boasting. By the end of the 1,920 seconds, he knew the maze of speakeasies, back rooms, and safe garages. He learned who in City Hall answered a phone at midnight, and which detectives shook hands with businessmen in daylight. The press printed famous massacres and shootouts, but that spectacle belonged to another era. Tony wanted longevity. He favored routines, clean ledgers for legitimate fronts, and layers that kept him away from the street. Under older bosses, he handled gambling halls, bookmakers, and mid-level crews who collected debts. The outfit, as Chicago's organization came to be known, adapted quickly after every arrest or headline. When Capone went to prison for tax charges in 1931, the enterprise stayed afloat under Frank Nitti and senior lieutenants. Tony rose a notch at a time. He didn't blow past others. He replaced them when they failed or retired. Prohibition ended in 1933, but the profits didn't stop. They moved. Slot machines appeared in back rooms. Card clubs gained regulars. Bookmaking followed baseball seasons and horse tracks. Import routes shifted from whiskey to other contraband. Labor rackets sprouted wherever a union touched shipping or construction. That period shaped Tony's mature style. He pruned chaos, kept meetings short, and insisted that public brawls ended careers. He had no interest in movie star swagger. He took a wife and moved toward the suburbs, settled into a routine that neighbors described as reserved. He still visited the city daily, yet he wanted his household quiet. He bought into legitimate companies as a shield: vending, coin, operated machines, parts suppliers. Reporters later traced many of those ownership webs and found associates in the filings. The design kept him behind several layers. He learned to let new faces front for old money. The 1,930 seconds also brought a shift westward into the entertainment business, where unions had leverage and studios could be pressured. Federal prosecutors later outlined a scheme in which figures tied to Chicago reached into Hollywood through union leaders, extracting payments to keep productions on schedule. Names like Willie Beoff and George Brown became fixtures in national headlines. Senior outfit men, among them Frank Nitti and Paul Ricca, faced charges. In 1943, when an indictment landed, Nitti took his own life rather than face trial. Ricca and others were convicted. That moment created a vacuum in leadership. The Chicago organization did not vanish. It adjusted. Ricca, though confined, still influenced decisions. He relied on steady hands, who could manage the day's operations without provoking new storms. Tony stepped forward into that role. Not officially, not in a ceremony, but in practice. He became the organizer who balanced the books, assigned crews, ensured deliveries, and paid the right people at the right time. The outfit's policy game, the neighborhood lottery, and the growing suburban gambling networks needed a patient steward. He grouped reliable men into factions that answered to him. When a hothead drew attention, he moved that person aside. His view of law enforcement matured too. This was the wartime era, when the federal government watched coastlines and factories. He kept his people focused on money that moved quietly. Card clubs outside city limits, slot machines in towns where talk traveled slowly, and wholesalers who delivered supplies without questions. He invested in restaurants and service companies. He went fishing on weekends and met business callers at midday, never late at night. It was here that the Big Tuna nickname eventually appeared. Years later, after a photo of a very large catch, journalists latched onto it, and it followed him through the 1,960 seconds. Back in the 1,940 seconds, he was not yet a headline personality. He preferred that. The war years brought new pressures from Washington, but the outfit's Chicago backbone stayed strong. Rail hubs, stockyards, and manufacturing districts kept cash flowing. Tony treated the city like a map of partnerships rather than turf to fight over. Suburban mayors appreciated clean streets and quiet nights. That meant no brawls, no flash, no loud cars in late hours. He could be seen at church with his family and home by dinner. Detectives who tried to nail him found him polite, well-dressed, and frustrating. He kept no incriminating papers. He used payphones and short meetings. The discipline filtered downward. This wasn't romance. It was logistics. Behind the polished manners sat an enterprise that collected a piece from gambling, loan operations, local contracts, and trucking links. Many people were harmed by those rackets. Debtors squeezed by high interest, small business owners forced to take overpriced services, workers pushed into union deals they didn't want. He knew the human cost, and he kept moving because the structure depended on momentum. Through the mid to late 1,940 seconds, Tony's influence became unmistakable. City reporters wrote that he was now the key man in the outfit. Police intelligence units heard the same. He rarely appeared in mugshots, rarely got tied to a scene. Others took those risks. He set policy. Avoid unnecessary violence. Avoid feud-making. Avoid meetings with too many cameras outside. Cash skimmed from gambling-fed investments in real estate, hotels, and service firms. Connections reached toward the Midwest, then toward Las Vegas, as the post-war boom turned a desert town into a neon outpost. Chicago money helped finance casinos and got paid back in steady percentages. Tony did not fly to Nevada often. He sent men who could blend in. He built a buffer of lieutenants who acted as lightning rods if a case broke. He also navigated internal politics with caution. Chicago's outfit included old-timers loyal to Nitti and Ricca, younger go-getters who saw the suburbs as a fresh bank, and union-minded operatives who preferred contracts over dice. Tony kept them pointed at the same goal: profit without headlines. His rulebook emphasized consistency. If a bookmaker fell behind, a warning came first. If a neighbor complained, the complaint got solved fast. If a politician asked a favor, he understood that favors flowed both ways. This was not a club. It was a business built on fear of consequences. but those consequences rarely appeared in public during his watch. He considered spectacle a tax no one should pay. By 1947 and 1948, it had become common for federal agents to list him as a top figure in Chicago, sharing influence with Ricca, who remained a guiding voice. The organizational chart never settled on a single title for Tony because he avoided formalities. Boss, underboss, acting boss papers used all three. What mattered was command. He handled it through trust he'd built since the Circus Cafe days. He rewarded loyalty with secure jobs and a share in legitimate ventures. He prized patience in people around him. Men who lived on adrenaline didn't last long. Public scrutiny intensified as the post-war years rolled into the early 1950s. National worries about organized crime brought Senate hearings and televised sessions that introduced America to a new vocabulary. The outfit had to adapt again. But as that next chapter opened, Tony remained a figure who moved in daylight yet kept a night person's secrets. He paid taxes on visible earnings and fought demands for testimony with legal counsel at his side. He stayed at home with his family and kept the old rule, say little. His skill lay not in escaping attention entirely, but in absorbing it and revealing almost nothing in return. He had started as a kid selling papers and driving routes. By middle age, he functioned as a chairman, managing risk for one of the most durable crime organizations in the country. His hard lessons paid off every time a camera lens looked for drama and found only a courteous man heading to a car. That poise explains how he outlived many contemporaries. It also explains how his decisions shaped the lives of thousands who never met him. Bar owners, casino employees, union members, debtors, police officers, and prosecutors whose careers advanced because of cases built around his name. Every step he took traced the boundaries of a city learning to live with an underworld that behaved like a quiet corporation. As the decade turned and the spotlight widened, the outfit prepared for scrutiny on a national stage. Chicago's operation remained profitable, but the country had changed. Television showed senators grilling witnesses under bright lights, and viewers at home leaned forward to learn which men truly ran the cities. Law enforcement gained tools, tax laws sharpened, and reporters got better at connecting front companies to hidden partners. Tony watched the change, measured the risk, and adjusted. He had weathered Prohibition's chaos, the Depression's lean years, and wartime pressures by staying methodical. Now he would face the age of cameras with the same method. Keep the circle small, let others chase the microphone. Move the money 2 steps farther from the source. The story of how he managed that period belongs to the next stretch of his life, when the public finally learned his nicknames, and government agencies learned to spell his last name without checking their notes twice. Television flooded living rooms with the Kefauver hearings, and the country learned how power looked under Klieg lights. Men in gray suits, eyes squinting, glasses of water untouched. In Chicago, the cameras found the usual addresses and familiar faces. They did not capture Tony pacing or shouting. They saw a calm figure who arrived on time, sat straight, and used the law to say nothing. He answered his name, confirmed his address, and then, to almost every pointed question about rackets, union pressure, or casino money, he invoked his constitutional rights. No raised voice, no argument, just a steady refrain delivered politely, which frustrated senators and fascinated viewers. That restraint told his crew everything. Survive the moment, do not explain yourself, and never help your opponent connect the dots. The hearings didn't stop business. They forced a new rhythm. Tony trimmed public appearances, shifted meetings to quiet restaurants in the suburbs, and added layers between himself and cash collection. He preferred frontmen with clean records, owners who looked like conventional managers, and lawyers who could explain every storefront's purpose if a license clerk asked. Vending route firms multiplied. Jukeboxes, cigarette machines, and pinball cabinets turned nickels into payrolls. Outfit accountants kept 2 sets of thoughts inside one ledger. A taxable version for auditors, and a private reckoning that made sure every route, captain, driver, and collector knew the schedule. Where a cafe owner balked at a machine, a visit followed with talk about service, security, and a steady crowd. Few argued twice. Gambling remained the engine. The old policy lottery in black neighborhoods brought in a mountain of small bets, and the outfit moved to centralize the drawing rooms and the daily count. Law enforcement files from the period linked that consolidation to pressure campaigns, and the removal of rivals who refused to fold. The tactic avoided spectacle. Sudden raids, quiet shuttering of a storefront, a car change on a favorite route so watchers lost the trail. Community leaders condemned the numbers racket as a tax on the poor. Tony saw only cash flow and predictability. He routed payouts through trusted houses and treated every clerk like a bank teller under scrutiny. When a runner went short, the correction was immediate and silent. That was his ethic. Keep the surface calm. Fix problems inside the walls. Never let the street see you stumble. Unions offered a different kind of leverage. Instead of dice and tickets, the currency was time and delivery. A few stewards in trucking, laundry, and building trades could slow a project to a crawl. Tony didn't run picket lines, he aligned relationships. Negotiators like Murray Humphreys handled the handshakes and the envelopes, and figures such as Jake Guzik maintained the calendar of who was owed a favor and when to call it in. Contractors learned that labor peace had a price. If they paid, the job moved smoothly. If they didn't, trucks idled outside gates, and materials arrived late. The outfit called it service. Prosecutors called it extortion. However labeled, it paid, and it gave Tony something he prized. A revenue stream that didn't involve headlines about raids. The Hollywood extortion scandal of the early 1940 seconds still cast long shadows. Paul Ricca, though restricted by the courts for a period, remained an advisor whose words mattered. With Ricca as counselor, Tony refined the organization into tiers, a board that settled disputes, a handful of area supervisors who kept books straight, and working crews who hid behind legitimate fronts. The structure extended beyond city limits into the collar counties, then across state lines where gambling laws were softer. He favored forays that could be disguised as regular commerce, coin-op distributors, linen supply firms, wholesale food vendors, waste hauling, and freight brokers. Paper trails looked clean at a glance, and Tony counted on the fact that only a dedicated agent with months of his life to spend could assemble the full picture. Las Vegas pulled at every Midwestern outfit with the promise of legal casinos. Chicago money went west through quiet lenders and trust companies. In the 1,950 seconds, those investment footprints were often light, a minority slice among other partners, but the expectation was firm. Profits returned home before they met the taxman. Investigators later called it the skim, the off-the-books portion that never reached a counting room ledger. Tony rarely traveled to Nevada. He sent disciplined men who understood that the casino's front door belonged to tourists and the back hallway belonged to accountants. He preferred partners who avoided nightclubs and gossip pages. Pictures were poison. Nevada officials saw the out-of-town connection and fought to keep licenses clean. The outfit responded by making sure an out-of-town owner looked like every other businessman in a suit. Public attention surged again after a meeting of bosses in upstate New York ended with police blocking country roads and taking names. The Appalachian arrests in 1957 turned national syndicate from rumor into headline fact for millions of Americans. Chicago did not get caught in that net the way other cities did. Tony had no interest in long drives to rural gatherings. He believed the phone and a private dining room could do the same work with less risk. Even so, the aftershocks reached him. The FBI reorganized, assigned more agents, and sharpened files. With heat rising, Tony adjusted. He stepped back from the front rank and let a younger, flashier street boss handle public exposure. Sam Giancana had energy, new contacts, and a taste for nightlife. Tony stayed nearby, within the same circle as Ricca, offering approvals or vetoes out of the spotlight. The board still decided big moves, but day-to-day attention shifted to the man who liked bright rooms and late hours. Sam's style worried the older guard. Singers, showrooms, and columnists drew photographers. Photographers drew subpoenas. Tony didn't argue in public, didn't criticize in bars, and never let a smirk give him away. He set boundaries in private. If a plan risked a mess, he said no. If a proposal promised steady money without ceremonies, he gave a quiet yes. He continued to cultivate relationships with businessmen who wanted protection from theft or a steady supply of vending machines, with tavern owners who feared rogue inspectors, and with local officials who appreciated donations at election season. The mix kept revenue balanced, Part gambling, part loan operations, part union leverage, part quasi-legitimate sales. Loan operations grew as post-war suburbs expanded. Families needed cars, appliances, and home repairs. Not everyone could get bank credit. Outfit lenders filled the gap at breaking 1E&D, rates that punished missed payments. Tony's rule was efficiency without spectacle. Collectors were told to avoid scenes. Someone behind on payments might receive a visit at work rather than at home, where neighbors and police could complicate matters. The aim was repayment, not commotion. Pain was profit's enemy because it drew eyes. He repeated that lesson until it became a reflex for crews under his supervision. As the 1,950 seconds closed, investigators renewed an old strategy: taxes. The government preferred provable numbers to rumor. Agents assembled lifestyle evidence houses, cars, club dues, and compared it to declared income. If the gap looked large, a case could form around the net worth method, tally known assets, and argue that the increase represented undeclared earnings. Tony found himself under that version of scrutiny. He hired attorneys who knew how to dismantle those arguments item by item, challenging calculations, questioning appraisals, and pointing to loans or gifts that could explain a jump without conceding criminal income. An indictment followed around the turn of the decade, and a courtroom fight began. Jurors heard about suits, restaurants, and travel. They heard a federal accountant describe columns of figures. The first round did not go Tony's way, but the appeal did. Judges later ruled that the government's math and methods had holes. The conviction fell. The result matched a pattern. He faced charges. He set a legal team in motion. He walked out to dinner. The death of longtime fixer Jake Guzik in 1956 forced an adjustment in the outfit's political and financial relations. Tony redistributed those responsibilities among veterans who understood discretion. The machine couldn't wobble. At the same time, he reinforced a principle that had kept him safe for decades: never break routine. He kept a quiet house in River Forest, attended Sunday services, read the sports pages, and met callers at ordinary hours in ordinary places. Detectives who tailed him often saw nothing but lunches and short drives. He accepted that constant surveillance was the tax of his position and taught younger men to treat being watched as a fact of life, not a reason to panic. The early 1,960 seconds brought another public education campaign about organized crime. This time through the McClellan Committee's labor racketeering hearings. Television audiences saw stewards and bosses pressed to explain pension funds, benefit plans, and sweetheart contracts. In the Midwest, that meant scrutiny of the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, which would later bankroll projects in Las Vegas and beyond. Tony understood the power of pension money. Loans secured by real estate and equipment looked legitimate and earned interest. The fund's guardianship rested with union figures who had long relationships with Chicago businessmen. Federal prosecutors and reporters traced lines between those loans and casinos that subsequently suffered Justice Department attention for skimming. Tony kept 3 steps back from the signatures. He let elevated associates handle introductions and terms, and he watched repayment schedules the way he watched betting sheets: steady, predictable, and free of headlines. During these years, his name showed up again and again in surveillance summaries, crime commission bulletins, and local columns that worked the syndicate beat. Many entries were mundane: a lunch at a steakhouse, a handshake at a club, a visit to a car dealer. That surface ordinariness masked the way he solved disputes. When crews argued over route boundaries or casino percentages, he listened, then imposed a fix with finality. He didn't raise his voice. He used the weight of accumulated authority. Associates considered his word binding because it came without theatrics, and because skirting it had consequences: careers ended, routes reassigned, incomes cut. His careful manner concealed steel. That blend, calm outside, iron inside, defined his management. Out on the street, bookmakers kept expanding to meet demand for football and basketball wagering. The outfit standardized procedures to reduce risk. Phone rooms moved periodically to limit wiretap exposure. Lists of bettors were pruned to remove anyone who asked odd questions or seemed too casual about credit. Tony encouraged a modular system. If a room fell, the operator could be replaced without a ripple across the city. Arrests came, of course, but they rarely climbed far up the ladder. Misdemeanors traded for fines, and operators learned to keep records thin. Lawyers had templates ready for every charge a patrolman could write. One aspect of his legacy during this stretch is the way he institutionalized restraint. The 1,920 seconds had taught him that noisy violence invites political crackdowns and public panic that dries up money. He trained men to think 2 or 3 moves ahead, choose the quiet route through a problem, buy time with a phone call, spend money before you spend blood. The effect on Chicago was real. Fewer public explosions, more low-level coercion that residents could sense but not always see. That does not make the system benign. It replaced chaos with control, and control can be just as suffocating to people squeezed by debt, pushed off a business, or forced to accept a contract they never wanted. Tony measured success by lack of attention, not by fairness. It is telling that despite constant surveillance and periodic indictments, he kept aging into comfort rather than into a cell. He once told a journalist, indirectly through counsel, that he was a businessman who had nothing to explain. The line was theater, but it sat on top of a truth. He built buffers that kept his hands distant from tasks that drew charges. Others placed bets, collected notes, signed for deliveries, and handed envelopes to couriers. He dealt in approvals more than in actions. That distance did not absolve him of responsibility for harms done by the machine he ran, but it helped him avoid the penalties that fell on those beneath him. By the time the early 1,960 seconds settled in, the outfit stood as a diversified enterprise, with influence stretching from neighborhood taverns to casino, counting rooms thousands of miles away. Tony Accardo presided as a chairman who preferred the shade, shared authority with Ricca, and tolerated front bosses who could absorb the press. His risk map covered grand juries, tax audits, labor inquiries, and state police task forces. He navigated by the same stars that had guided him since he was a teenager on Halstead. Keep your voice low, never chase a camera, do the arithmetic twice, and place your trust in routine. The next years would test those habits as celebrity crept closer to the center of his circle, and federal agencies sharpened tools that had barely existed when he started. But he had survived longer than anyone who had trained him because he refused to teach his enemies what he was thinking. He let them guess while he ate lunch and checked his watch. By the early 1,960 seconds, the city had learned to tell the difference between noise and power. The newspapers loved a nightclub story. They loved a chase, a late-night arrest, a spotlight catching famous faces. Real authority didn't look like that. It sat in a booth at lunch, it carried a quiet calendar, it told people where to be and when to stop talking. That was how Accardo kept his balance, while public life swirled around Sam Giancana. Sam enjoyed bright rooms and crooners, and he gathered acquaintances from show business who drew columnists like moths. The older guard, with Paul Ricca still counseling from the background, watched carefully. Accardo kept his jacket buttoned, his replies short, and his calendar full of routine. He did not forbid flair, he distrusted it. When reporters leaned toward a doorway pulsing with music, he preferred a back entrance at a quiet steakhouse, where conversation stayed with the people at the table. The pressure from Washington rose after the election of 1,960. A new attorney general treated organized crime as a priority rather than a periodic press release. Task forces formed. Grand juries ran longer. Wiretap teams learned neighborhoods and faces. Phone rooms for sports bets shifted addresses more often, and collection routes for gambling receipts changed cars midweek. Accardo made that discipline normal. He did not shut business. He adjusted risk. Gambling remained the center of the map: horse tracks, ball games, parlay cards, quiet back rooms with cards and dice. The take fed a system that included loans to bettors who fell behind, a share of vending in bars, service contracts for taverns and small clubs, and leverage over key unions whose cooperation made trucking and construction run smoother. None of it worked without habits. He insisted on those first. Short meetings, no bragging, no late-night theatrics that sent investigators home with good quotes. Federal agents took aim at him with numbers, the method he had long expected. A tax case reached a jury early in the decade, built on lifestyle, math, and bank deposits. Prosecutors showed pictures of a comfortable home, an easy car, a life that did not square with the income lines on a return. Jurors agreed. He was convicted. On appeal, his lawyers unpicked the government's calculations and the way they had built their case. The higher court threw it out. The decision reinforced what he already believed. Paper must either be explained or not exist. After that, he tightened buffers around his spending, let legitimate income stand in front, and kept large gifts and loans inside circles of trust. He was not bulletproof. He was careful, and he treated every demand for records as a lesson. Sam's expanding profile helped in one obvious way and hurt in another. Flashy stories gave the cameras something to chew on besides the quiet men behind them. But flash brought risk. A romance with a famous singer kept Sam in gossip columns, and columnists had cousins in newsrooms where crime reporters pitched new angles. When a federal grand jury summoned him, he met the summons and declined to cooperate. Contempt charges followed. Jail time followed that. At each step, Accardo stayed where he had always stood, a pace behind the front and at the head of the table when it was time to set policy. He didn't argue about music or personalities. He argued about exposure and returns. When jail left Sam angry and unwatched for a time, Accardo set a new operating boss in place. Sam Battaglia, blunt and forceful, took the day-to-day reins for a stretch. The larger board stayed the same, Rica advised. Accardo approved or vetoed. Revenue kept to its lanes. Bookmaking, backroom play, loans, labor peace, distribution contracts, and a quiet reach into entertainment districts where doormen knew which rooms were for regulars. Union leverage matured into a predictable instrument during these years. Accardo prized predictability. A shipping company negotiating a contract preferred a smooth season over a public fight. The outfit traded on that preference. A foreman who knew the right steward could calm a job site. A hotel owner whose staff belonged to a particular local could solve a staffing problem before a convention. On the surface, these were business arrangements. Underneath, the terms were not optional, and prices rose when someone stalled. Prosecutors called it coercion, backed by fear. The effect in the city was plain. Some projects finished ahead of schedule, others paid late fees, and the insiders got paid either way. Accardo separated these conversations from gambling work so one raid or arrest wouldn't ripple across the map. If a labor case built heat, the bookmakers kept their phones running because they were on a different floor of the structure. Las Vegas remained a distant but vital pillar. The outfit's slice wasn't overt and rarely had a nameplate. It lived in finder's fees, loans that bought influence, and assurances that a promised stream would keep flowing. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund became a critical hinge in this system. Loans to hotel casino developments looked like economic development to the outside world, and delivered interest plus leverage to those who set the terms. Chicago figures didn't always sit at the signing table, yet their wishes traveled with the money. Accardo did not put himself on a plane and pose under neon signs. He sent men who treated the trip like a business call. The unspoken understanding was simple. The books for the state would show one set of numbers. A smaller count would return to the Midwest before it became a line item on a tax return. Investigators suspected this. They needed proof. Proof was hard because paperwork was neat, and the people who handled the count spoke sparingly. Appalachian shock had trained bosses to avoid social gatherings. The next decade sharpened that lesson, with microphones hidden in lamps and walls. Agents placed audio bugs in bars, luncheonettes, and club offices. Some recorded gossip, some recorded business. The outfit responded by shifting venues, breaking meetings into shorter segments, and keeping strategy in the car during a slow drive with the radio on. Accardo's style fit that environment. He never liked crowd scenes. He never trusted long evenings. He favored daylight and a short list of callers. Detectives who tailed him got familiar with the same dining rooms and the same careful schedule. The man they watched was courteous to waiters and cool in conversation, handing out decisions that settled turf disputes, adjusted percentages, and reminded people that the goal was not victory on a single deal, but a long run with steady returns. Replacing Sam as field leader produced friction in the middle ranks. People with momentum disliked any pause. Accardo handled it by clarifying expectations. If someone was owed a slice, they got it. If someone exceeded a boundary, they lost that privilege. He saw leadership as the act of preventing arguments from ripening into feuds. Chicago had witnessed feuds decades earlier. The cost had been police raids, emergency legislation, and years of attention. He had no intention of repeating that script. The outfit under his quiet chairmanship used different tools: demotions, reassignment, a sudden retirement, or the transfer of a route to a calmer hand. When someone outside the outfit threatened a reliable earner, the response was firm but designed to avoid the front page. He saw public mess as an expense line that paid no dividend. Even while he kept returns solid, legal pressure did not fade. Crime commissions published charts with names and arrows pointing at him. The FBI ran a top hoodlum program whose very title signaled where their energy went. The attention didn't change his routine. If anything, it reinforced it. He took fewer risks with travel, signed less in his own name, and invested more attention in businesses that dealt in cash but looked respectable at a glance. Coin, op distributors, supply firms, and service contractors. A few paid taxes like any other company because taxes bought legitimacy when a license board pulled a file. He built the outfit's legal front as if he expected every ledger to lie on a courtroom table one day. If that day came, he wanted dull entries that bored jurors. The mid-1960 seconds also forced changes at the top as older allies passed. Jake Guzik was gone already, leaving a gap in the quiet diplomacy between the outfit and City Hall. Others aged out or crossed the law at the wrong moment. Sam Battaglia ran into legal trouble for coercive schemes, and a new caretaker stepped in. Felix, Milwaukee Phil Alderizio. A figure with a hard reputation, who nevertheless kept to the policy of restraint. Accardo supervised each transition as a handoff, not a struggle. Titles shifted, the center remained. The crew leaders who mattered most were the ones who could steer profits without calling attention to themselves, and he protected those people by absorbing any blow that needed an executive decision. Legal tools evolved again with the passage of the racketeering statute in 1970. RICO allowed prosecutors to tell jurors a story about a group rather than insist on a narrow snapshot of a single night. That law threatened the very method that had kept him safe distance, buffers, and a lack of signatures. He replied with further distance. Meetings grew shorter. Phone calls moved from one payphone to another. People who once reported directly to him now spoke to a trusted intermediary. He also leaned harder into seemingly ordinary investments that could support a lifestyle in plain view. A share of a restaurant here, a stake in a supply house there, money in real estate managed by reliable partners. Nothing about these choices made him innocent. They made him durable. As the new decade opened, a younger face took on a special assignment out west. Tony Accardo, raised on Chicago streets and known for tenacity, moved to Las Vegas to protect the outfit's interests and enforce discipline among independent earners. Accardo had long preferred a separated structure for Nevada, one man for finance, another for compliance, a third for handling street problems. Accardo represented the latter category. His presence signaled that the city in the desert would no longer rely on handshakes alone to keep streams of money steady. Chicago also backed a talented oddsman and casino supervisor whose skills belonged on the counting room side of the house. The two roles, money management and oversight of independent operators, were meant to support each other without making a spectacle. The plan worked for a while, and Chicago's percentage stayed healthy. The risk, always, was that personalities would overtake policy. Accardo watched for that from Illinois, in constant contact through emissaries who flew west with instructions and returned with news. At home, he entered the 1,970 seconds as a figure the city knew by sight but not by voice. He lived with his family in River Forest, kept to a straightforward routine, and let others enjoy the status of meeting callers late. Grand juries still wanted him in a chair. He still declined to talk about other people's business. As he aged into a gentler rhythm church on Sunday, golf or fishing when the weather cooperated, his control did not loosen. If anything, men who had built their careers under his rules showed even more deference because he had delivered them decades without the chaos that wrecks organizations. Paul Ricca's death in 1972 closed an era. The man who had navigated the outfit through the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, who had entrusted daily decisions to Accardo when prison removed his freedom, was gone. Without Ricca's quiet second voice, Accardo became the elder without a peer. He did not change his style. He still preferred decisions by consensus among a few senior figures, with one of them holding the public-facing title. That title, a Cicero veteran who knew the vending routes, the taverns, and the importance of keeping trouble out of sight. Ayupa's own brushes with the law, including a memorable federal case over protected birds that made headlines for its irony, reminded everyone that even the small mistakes could sting. Accardo used those moments as teaching tools. Stay boring. Follow routines. Let the money do the talking. The list of crimes tied to his enterprise by prosecutors and commissions in this period was long and consistent with earlier decades. Illegal gambling in many forms. Coercion tied to labor contracts. High-interest loans enforced with pressure. Hidden stakes in service firms that won municipal business. Coordination with out-of-state casino operators to ensure streams returned to Chicago. Bribery that greased licensing and inspection. Hijacking of truckloads along interstate routes still happened on the margins, not as a central business but as an adjunct in years when a crew needed income or someone wanted leverage over a distributor. Adult vice districts that flourished in certain suburbs paid for protection, though Accardo discouraged scenes that drew church protests and camera crews. He viewed every racket through the same lens. Is it quiet? Is it stable? And does it attract a kind of attention that can't be managed? If a scheme failed those tests, he cut it loose even if it promised quick returns. What sets his 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds run apart is less the list of activities than the way he standardized them. He turned improvisation into a method. Men who had once behaved like freelancers now acted like managers within a conservative firm. There were budgets, schedules, and plans for what to do when a lieutenant fell to an indictment. He valued people who could fill in for each other without drama. He valued heat maps that told him which suburbs felt safe for a card room and which aldermen needed a fundraiser before they signed off on a zoning change. He valued patience more than speed and information more than bluster. By the time he entered his mid-60s, he had outlasted 2 generations of lawmen and 3 generations of apprentices. He remained a target of surveillance, a name on charts in offices where agents pinned photos to corkboards, a cause of frustration for prosecutors who preferred dramatic testimony to the silence he maintained. Yet the reason he endured isn't a mystery. He built routines that made him hard to catch doing anything himself, cultivated a bland public image that fed no headlines, and ran an organization that learned to replace spectacle with systems. That approach carried him from neighborhood errands to the chairmanship of the city's shadow economy, then through an era of televised scrutiny into a new age shaped by federal racketeering laws. The next phase would test everything he had built, because success breeds jealousy, because even the best shield has seams, and because one violation of his rule about avoiding attention would bring trouble directly to his front door. In winter 1978, the rule he prized most stay invisible was broken, while he sat under a warm sky far from Chicago. Burglars slipped into his River Forest house and went through it room by room, pulling out drawers, tossing closets, leaving a mess that made the evening papers before he even flew home. To outsiders, it was a daring score. To him, it was something worse, a violation that advertised his name and invited gawkers to drive past the address. He did not rant. He absorbed the insult, calmed his family, and let it be known through quiet channels that the city had lines you did not cross. In the months that followed, several suspected thieves turned up dead in separate incidents. Detectives linked those cases to the break-in by rumor, informants, and later testimony from people who had drifted through the outfit's orbit. No charges ever tied him to the retaliation, yet the message carried: keep away from the chairman's home. Street crews took the lesson to heart. Reporters saw only a patient man who replaced locks, then sat down to dinner like any suburban neighbor. That episode hardened his old habits. He tightened circles, trimmed meetings to minutes, and kept business away from any place with a camera. He gave more responsibility to lieutenants who already understood his low-profile style. They pushed routine across the map with the steadiness he liked. Gambling in controlled rooms and through quiet phone banks. Loan collections run like a bank's past due department. Union contacts who solved problems for companies that preferred predictability to fights. Protection that looked like security contracts and vending routes. If a club wanted music and machines, a distributor appeared with a package deal. If a tavern feared troublemakers, a polite man promised peaceful nights. The money came in small streams that added up. Enforcement stayed invisible when possible. He repeated the same line inside the house: public drama destroys profit. Las Vegas remained a pillar that could not wobble. In the early 1970s, Nevada regulators tightened standards, blacklisting people they believed served out-of-state interests. Tony Accardo, a hard-edged operative with roots in Chicago, took an assignment in the desert to safeguard revenue and watch independent earners who strayed too close to casino streams. The plan split responsibilities. One set of hands managed finance and the counting rooms. Accardo managed street problems and side earners who had a habit of inviting heat. For a time, the arrangement produced what Chicago wanted: healthy returns from legal casinos and control over satellite hustles that had always orbited the Strip. Accardo stayed in Illinois, tracking numbers through trusted intermediaries who flew back and forth. He expected discipline. He expected that trips to the desert would look like business, not like vacations under neon. Federal pressure climbed anyway. The FBI built cases with a new law, the racketeering statute that allowed them to present a system rather than isolate one bet or one envelope. Kansas City wiretaps caught talk about casino skimming that spilled across state lines. That evidence, combined with legwork in Las Vegas, led to strawman indictments in the early 1980s. Chicago names appeared, including public bosses like Joey Aiuppa and John Cerrone, both veterans tied to Cicero's money machine. The allegation was simple and devastating. A slice of casino revenue never reached the taxman's ledger. It went to Midwestern bosses through couriers and secret counts. Accardo was not the one in a courtroom that year. He watched as jurors listened to tapes, reviewed ledgers, and convicted men who had occupied the front rank. Those convictions in 1986 sent Aiuppa and Cerrone to prison for long terms, a shock that forced a rapid reshuffle at home. The outfit did not collapse. It hated vacuums. It named new caretakers and kept revenue moving. But the strain showed. While prosecutors mapped money in Las Vegas, the town itself spun off problems that bled into Chicago. Accardo's crew in Nevada, the one tasked with handling rogues and watching the street, drifted from quiet enforcement into headline crimes. The hole-in-the-wall gang, as locals dubbed a circle of burglars linked to him, specialized in breaking through walls to reach safes and showcases. A high-profile bust in 1981 police waiting at a shop and scooping up masked men undercut the old rule about avoiding scenes. Nevada regulators had already banned Accardo from casinos. Now he faced charges and relentless media attention. In 1982, a famous casino figure, associated with Chicago interests, survived a car bomb in Las Vegas, an attack that made national news. Investigators wrote that the climate around Chicago's investments had turned reckless. That was not an environment Accardo tolerated. His standards demanded distance, order, and invisibility. The opposite was happening under neon, and the fallout would be severe. Back in Illinois, he responded the way he always did, by reasserting procedure. Day-to-day control of the outfit moved to a leader whose instincts matched his own. Joseph Ferriola, a Cicero-raised manager known for steady collection and solid discipline, took charge in the mid-1980s. Accardo, older now and mindful of his health, remained the senior authority who made final calls and protected the core strategy. Ferriola pushed revenue towards stable streams. Sports betting across all seasons, card rooms that shifted location before a pattern formed, loans that stayed on a schedule, and labor leverage packaged as consulting. Municipal contracts in waste hauling, tavern service, and supply firms gave the house legal income that could stand under a license board's questions. Gus Alex, the outfit's longtime bridge to city fixers and quiet money, smoothed political rough edges. That combination, Ferriola's management, Alex's diplomacy, Accardo's policy, kept the enterprise from tipping during and after the Las Vegas trials. The federal top hoodlum program still marked Accardo as a priority. Agents tailed him to lunches and watched golf outings. They photographed him putting groceries in a car. Grand juries sought his testimony. He declined to discuss others, invoking rights with the same mild tone he had used since the 1950 seconds. The tax angle never disappeared. Accountants with badges probed, lifestyle against reported income, hunting for gaps they could present to jurors. He hired counsel who had practiced these fights for decades. Cases came. Cases faded. He paid some penalties for paperwork and kept living at home. He did not gloat. He followed a rule that survived more than half a century: never celebrate. The fallout from the burglary at his house lingered as a cautionary tale in every crew. Young thieves swapped the story like a campfire warning. Touch the old man's door and you disappear. Chicago crime reporters wrote columns stitching together a string of unsolved killings they connected to that break-in. Detectives agreed in private. Prosecutors could not build a case that climbed high. The most they could do was state in public proceedings that the spree of violence matched an obvious motive. An insult answered with finality. Accardo allowed no comment, showed up in suit and tie for every hearing, and returned to his table at a regular restaurant where the waiter knew his order. For a man so closely linked to a violent secret, he projected calm that neighbors found almost ordinary. Inside the outfit, the list of crimes stayed familiar, even as tools changed. Illegal gambling anchored the budget. Parlay cards in autumn, basketball lines through winter, baseball all spring and summer, horses year-round. Phone rooms dotted the suburbs. Operators rotated locations, and calls hit lines that were replaced before wire warrants arrived. Loan collections continued under the euphemism of help, with terms that punished missed payments, but aimed to avoid scenes. Labor clout worked through two levers: the promise of delivery on time if a company made the right friends, and the threat of delays if it didn't. Vending routes in bars and clubs turned quarters into a river of cash that could be taxed when useful. A slice of adult vice in certain districts paid for peace with city inspectors and a minimum of noise. Extortion lived in euphemisms, security contracts, consulting fees, placements that kept conversations legal enough for a tape recorder to miss the point. The difference in the 1,980 seconds came from the government's ability to tell a long story in one case. RICO let prosecutors loop multiple acts together, tie them to a structure, and lay a net over people who had not touched a suitcase or a betting slip in years. Accardo understood that risk earlier than most. He had built his life around buffers precisely because he expected a law like RICO to make distance the only real protection. His management style, thin paper trails, quiet meetings, no boastful talk, now looked like foresight. He leaned harder into that method and trained every replacement to copy it. When a courtroom readout published a list of convictions, the names were often the same men who had embraced attention, or speed. The chairman endured by insisting on the opposite. The shock in 1986 was personal and public. Tony Spilotro and his younger brother were found dead after disappearing from Chicago. News bulletins flashed across the country. Law enforcement quickly suggested an internal execution approved by senior leadership because Las Vegas had become a hazard. Later trials unrelated to the killings produced testimony confirming that senior figures had called for an end to Spilotro's run. Accardo's name surfaced in stories that speculated about who had approved what, but no prosecution ever put him in a witness chair for that matter. The effect on the organization was clear, even without a verdict. Nevada's era of familiar faces gave way to corporate control over casinos, federal scrutiny of pension loans deepened, and Chicago's future lay in quieter rackets closer to home. His daily life grew smaller as the decade closed. He moved from River Forest to a quieter, farther suburb with more space and fewer passers-by who remembered the old headlines. He aged into a routine that neighbors found sedate: a walk, a drive to a favorite restaurant, church on Sunday. Inside that gentle surface, he kept track of everything. He knew who filled the void left by Ayupa and Cerrone. He knew which suburban police departments had new chiefs and which judges were sensitive to press. He knew how the Teamsters Fund's oversight had changed under new national leadership, limiting the kind of loans that once underwrote casino towers. He knew that a city which had tolerated a shadow economy for 50 years now had a new generation of officials trained under reforms that arose from earlier scandals. The field was still playable, but the sidelines had moved. Through it all, he did not abandon legitimate investments. The outfit's face in the 1,980 seconds wore a corporate mask. Waste-hauling firms secured municipal contracts. Linen services supplied hotels and hospitals. Food distribution companies delivered to cafeterias. These businesses generated tax returns and invoices that explained house payments and membership dues. He wanted anyone reading a file to see a version of normal. He also wanted younger men to earn a legal income that lessened their need to reach for risky envelopes. He had seen too many impulsive earners drag an entire crew into danger because they could not resist quick scores. His strategy rewarded patience with stability. By the end of the decade, he had outlived nearly every mentor, rival, and many students. He had also outlasted several federal campaigns that had seemed at their launch, like the end of the outfit. The reason was not luck. It was a philosophy. Never create evidence against yourself. Never chase the headline. Never forget that attention raises costs. That view bled into the city's fabric, in ways both visible and subtle. Bookmakers stopped acting like characters and started behaving like clerks. Couriers drove like salesmen. Lawyers worked full-time for street clients and talked like accountants. The organization still harmed people through unpayable debt, pressure on small business owners, and leverage over workers who wanted genuine choice, but it did so in a way that left fewer traces on the sidewalk. Accardo had refined that stance over 5 decades. He closed the 1,980 seconds as he had closed each previous era. At home, in control of himself, and with enough influence to be felt. Across a city that pretended not to know him, he had adjusted after a burglary that brought trouble to his lawn. He had navigated Las Vegas from 1,000 miles away, while others took the fall. He had repositioned the Chicago operation when public bosses went to prison. He had recommitted to a style that prized caution over hunger. He walked into the next stretch of years with the same unremarkable habits that had kept him free. Short meetings, careful words, and a mind that never stopped counting. Age refined his instincts rather than soften them. The late 1,980 seconds had proved that the method he built, silence, short meetings, predictable routines, could keep the organization upright even when juries sent public bosses away. He let younger hands take the wheel for day-to-day work and concentrated on 2 things: preserving income streams that didn't invite scenes and keeping lines to city fixers open without parades or speeches. That meant a steady push toward businesses that looked normal at a glance: hauling contracts, linen service, coin-op distributors, supply houses, alongside the familiar spine of bookmaking, private card rooms, and loans that punished missed payments quietly. The mix gave him what he always wanted: options. If one source drew heat, another kept the payroll steady. Joseph Ferriola's run as field leader showed how Accardo preferred to manage a transition. Ferriola wasn't a nightclub performer. He was a collector with a calendar, a manager who demanded schedules be met and who stayed away from gossip columns. Under him, the outfit rebalanced after the Las Vegas trials. Sports wagering expanded with more sophisticated odds work. Phone rooms moved regularly, and collections ran like a cautious bank. The organization still took a piece from vending routes and tavern supply, and union leverage still smoothed deliveries for companies that understood the price of peace. Accardo's counsel to every lieutenant stayed the same: keep the surface tidy, keep partners content, keep your temper off the street. Ferriola's health declined, and in 1989 he died. The vacancy at the front brought Sam "Wings" Carlisi forward. Carlisi had grown up in Cicero's earning culture and understood why the older man despised flash. His assignment was basic and hard: hold the center, avoid feuds, and give prosecutors nothing dramatic. He did that by relying on old hands in predictable areas, bookmaking in the suburbs, card rooms that shifted locations before pattern recognition set in, quiet pressure in labor disputes, and consulting arrangements that made delivery schedules miraculously smooth. Gus Alex continued to play the diplomatic role that had defined his career, bridging businessmen, ward figures, and outfit managers, so that favors looked like paperwork rather than threats. While the front adapted, federal pressure didn't relax. Investigators targeted the First Ward's fixers, the political machinery that for decades had translated cash and influence into licenses, zoning, and soft landings. Aldermen and clerks faced wiretaps and cooperating witnesses. Those cases painted a picture that reporters had drawn in pencil for years: a pipeline between wardrooms, courtrooms, and people who handled collections for the outfit. Accardo didn't travel to those offices or end up on many tapes. He trusted intermediaries to keep him briefed and expected them to step back if the air warmed. His name still anchored law enforcement charts, but his presence in case exhibits stayed minimal because he refused to speak freely with anyone and avoided scenes that microphones could immortalize. One reason he endured was the way he trained men to accept surveillance as a constant. By the time he was in his 80s, agents saw him at lunchtime more often than at night, watched him pay for groceries, and photographed him walking slower to his car. They recorded ordinary days because ordinary days were all he allowed. That visible calm did not mean resignation. He still reviewed lists, insisted on punctual envelopes, demanded precise accounting from route captains, and reminded people never to improvise in a way that created noise. A collector in a hurry could turn an account into a newspaper story. A new casino contact could turn a loan into a conspiracy when the Justice Department cared about the lender's past. He had seen a lifetime of cases. He carried those lessons in a few phrases. Be polite, be brief, and leave no echo. The string of killings that followed the burglary at his house years earlier continued to haunt columns and case files. Chicago crime reporters kept returning to that break-in as a hinge in his myth. The quiet chairman violated in his own living room. The city answering with a whisper that turned deadly for suspected burglars. Detectives voiced the same conclusion privately. Later federal testimony by an outfit insider, years after Accardo's death, reinforced the storyline that leadership had sanctioned reprisals. The accounts presented him as the offended elder whose anger triggered permission, not as a man seen at a scene. He was never charged. He never addressed it. He simply resumed the routine that projected harmlessness while the message spread on its own. Some lines stayed sacred in a world that ran on fear and favor. Vegas faded as a personal concern, not because the money vanished, but because corporate owners and stricter licensing regimes pushed the kind of hidden influence he preferred to the edges. Pension loans faced new oversight. State boards knew the old tricks and screened partners with fresh zeal. Chicago money still found routes to investments, but the risk-to-reward ratio had changed. He adjusted by concentrating on the Midwest, where history, habits, and long-standing contacts still made the map readable. Waste hauling and scrap, a natural fit for men who could assemble crews and equipment fast. Delivered city contracts that underwrote houses and dues. Linen and uniform services landed long agreements with hotels and hospitals. Distribution companies supplied kitchens and cafeterias. Every invoice was a shield when a tax agent asked how a man paid for a country club membership. None of that erased the harm caused by the outfit's methods. People fell behind on notes and lived with the dread of a visit. Some merchants paid for machines they didn't want because the alternative was trouble they couldn't afford. Union members found contracts shaped by interests they did not vote for. Accardo understood the pressure's human toll, and he faced no illusion about what collected the money that kept his calm life possible. He believed the system's survival depended on restraint. That word served him two ways. Restraint limited violence that brought ruinous attention. It also masked coercion under the polite language of business. That is why his public image could settle into a portrait of a well-mannered retiree, even as the machine beneath continued to cost people money and choice. The early 1,990 seconds brought legal blows to people around him. First ward figures faced racketeering charges. Gus Alex, for decades the outfit's ambassador to businessmen and fixers, met a federal case in 1992 that described a years-long extortion network built on fear of union trouble. He was convicted and sent away, a symbolic end to an era when a certain phone call could make inspectors vanish and permits appear. Sam Carlisi would later face a sweeping racketeering case that described a hierarchy, gambling routes, and loan collection schemes. Accardo watched these turns like a man reading stock reports. None of it surprised him. He had predicted years earlier that the government would write broad narratives and persuade juries with the total picture rather than a single charge. He had organized his life to survive that shift. At home, he slowed. He moved farther from the city to a quiet property with room to breathe. A hedge against curious drivers who had memorized his river forest address. Days began with ordinary errands and ended with familiar meals. Sundays belonged to church. Grandchildren visited. Golf and fishing remained rituals when health allowed. Yet the phone still rang, visitors still came for guidance, and envelopes still moved according to a calendar he had taught younger men to keep. He refused all interviews. When a subpoena demanded his presence, he showed up, answered basic identity questions, and declined the rest within his rights. Reporters scribbled notes about a courteous elder who smiled politely and left by a side door. His reputation by then rested on two pillars: longevity and a near-clean record in court. He had been charged and even convicted once on a tax case decades earlier, only to see the decision overturned on appeal. After that, nothing stuck long enough to take his freedom for more than short stints. Agents found that infuriating because they believed, with cause based on informants and later court testimony, that his hands had directed a structure responsible for a catalog of crimes, illegal gambling in every season, skimming from casino profits in prior years, extortion disguised as labor help, high-interest loans collected through pressure, slices of service companies that won government business, bribery that hooked into licensing and inspection. Even in retirement, he remained the person others deferred to when a choice could change earnings across the city. He embodied the principle that a boss's most valuable habit is not to leave fingerprints on the work. In May 1992, at 86, he died at home of natural causes. No dramatic last scene. No sirens. A private funeral followed at a Catholic church in the suburbs. The cemetery at Hillside took him into a marble crypt alongside family. Television trucks parked at a distance and film suits arriving, then drifted away, leaving a small crowd to share memories about a man who spoke softly and kept a city guessing for 6 decades. Big Tuna, the nickname born years earlier from a photo of a fish, appeared in obituaries because journalists loved a hook. Those same pieces noted that he had outlived most contemporaries, spent almost no time in prison, and changed the culture of organized crime in Chicago from headline violence to bureaucratic control. The outfit did not fold when he left the stage. It adjusted once more. Carlisi's case rolled forward. Other veterans stepped into roles with titles that meant less than the consensus needed to make money without chaos. A newer generation took cues from the view he had hammered home since the Circus Cafe days. Be punctual, be dull, let the lawyers do the talking, and keep revenue diversified, so a raid in one field doesn't starve the whole. The political climate grew less tolerant of wardroom deals as reformers learned from earlier scandals. Pension scrutiny tightened, limiting grand desert adventures. Federal statutes gave prosecutors nets large enough to catch planners who thought distance would save them. Even with those changes, Chicago still carried scars from a system he helped refine: habits of fear, quiet favoritism, and a shadow economy that crept into ordinary transactions. Looking back from that closing chapter, the arc of his life is stark. A boy who left school early learned to deliver orders for men who ran an illegal alcohol empire. He watched Prohibition end and turned from booze to betting. He kept his voice down while others chased fame and paid for it. He climbed to a chairmanship that no court could prove in paperwork and held it for decades. He pressed loyalty and routine into a code that outlasted the roaring era that made his city famous for bullets and headlines. The crimes linked to his name by prosecutors and commissions never read like a short list because the enterprise he tended touched so many corners of daily life. A bar's jukebox, a construction site's schedule, a casino's back hallway, a phone line buzzing during a football game, a shop owner's loan. The damage rarely crashed into the street in spectacular fashion after his rise. It seeped quietly, attacks on neighborhoods that never saw the boardroom where decisions were made. Years after his burial, federal courtrooms would hear witnesses describe scenes from the past. The sanctioned retaliation after his house was ransacked, the vote that ended the Spilotro era, the way cash from card rooms and sports bets traveled through couriers to men who never wrote a receipt. Those accounts came long after he was gone and could not defend or explain himself. They matched what agents had suspected while watching him eat lunch, and they hardened the public's understanding of how Chicago's underworld managed to remain both present and invisible. Whether remembered as Joe Batters, Big Tuna, or simply the Old Man, his imprint remained as a set of rules others followed. He had made a criminal organization behave like a conservative firm, and that transformation shaped a city long after his quiet exit from the scene. He left the stage in 1992, but some of the choices that defined his power were forged decades earlier, in rooms where curtains stayed closed and conversation never rose above a firm whisper. The clearest example came from the years when Sam Giancana drew publicity like a magnet. At first, Giancana's connections and energy looked useful. He could move money fast and charm crowds. Then the noise grew. He did a contempt stint for refusing to cooperate with a grand jury, fled to Mexico when heat intensified, returned years later under orders, and in 1975 was shot in his Oak Park home just before he was expected to speak with federal authorities. Law enforcement quickly suspected an internal purge approved by senior leaders who wanted the spotlight turned off. Reporters wrote Accardo's name with cautious verbs: linked, associated, believed. No charge reached him for that killing. He made no statement. He simply ensured that the next public face of the outfit was a manager, not a celebrity. That episode underlined a principle he had already been living for decades. Fame is fatal in his line of work. He had watched the city learn that lesson many times. The earliest teachers were the Prohibition years, when newspaper front pages celebrated shootouts and then ran follow-ups on raids, new laws, and sweeping prosecutions. Accardo took the opposite path. He avoided the camera during the Capone era, and when the 1929 Street Valentine's Day Massacre rewired Chicago's politics, he absorbed another warning spectacle invites reform. Later stories and some detectives suspected he had played a role in that notorious ambush while disguised as a policeman. Evidence never proved it, and he never acknowledged any part. He carried away the same conclusion either way. Stay small, move quietly, make money. During the 1,930 seconds, he built a manager's toolkit. He kept early crews focused on gambling rooms that shifted address, on slot machines that migrated from city neighborhoods to friendlier suburbs, and on the neighborhood lottery known as policy. He learned to maintain buffers, front owners with clean records, distributors with invoices, drivers who looked like delivery men. He also learned to appear helpful. Taverns that took machines received service that included security at the door and few visits from surprise inspectors. Unions that aligned with outfit expectations enjoyed smooth contract talks. Those that balked met delays. To the target, the exchange looked like choice. In truth, refusal carried a price. Prosecutors would later call that extortion dressed as business, and they were right. He enforced rules that limited risk. No flamboyant trouble, no public brawls, no partnerships that put his name on paper. He also told men under him to avoid narcotics. It wasn't a moral stand. It was an actuarial one. Drug cases unspooled into wide nets and sent defendants away for long terms. He kept the outfit's money in gambling, loan collections, union leverage, and slices of otherwise ordinary commerce: coin-op, linen service, hauling, supply houses. Individuals still broke his drug rule from time to time. He punished the breach, not because he thought the substance was worse than gambling, but because it attracted agents who never quit. Hollywood revealed both the reach and the risk of his world. In the late 1,930 seconds and early 1,940 seconds, Willie Beoff and stagehand boss George Brown shook down studios by threatening to slow productions. The scheme drew national attention. Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, and others were pulled into cases and punished. Nitti killed himself in 1943 rather than face trial. Ricca did time. From that moment, Accardo occupied the role he would hold for decades. Operational head, answering to Ricca's advice but carrying daily responsibility. He reorganized, dispersed risk, and continued to generate money in ways that Swissa watched their own timing payout schedules for numbers games, collections on Mondays, payroll on Fridays, brief meetings at lunch, where no one ordered a second coffee. Television's arrival brought a different kind of pressure. The Kefauver hearings in 1951 taught Americans that crime could look like a banker in a good suit. Accardo played that image to perfection. He obeyed subpoenas, confirmed his name and address, and then relied on the Bill of Rights to avoid giving them a script. The senators looked stern. He looked calm. Back home, he made adjustments. More distance between his seat and the money. New frontmen with clean backgrounds, better lawyers. He built a labyrinth of businesses that produced receipts and tax returns to explain a comfortable life. Not every dollar had a clean origin, but enough did to throw off many audits. Tax law still found him. Late in the 1,950 seconds, he was charged with evasion based on the net worth method, a technique that compares lifestyle and assets against declared income. A jury convicted him in 1960. His lawyers attacked the government's math. In 1962, an appellate panel agreed that the case's foundation was weak. The conviction fell. The sequence hardened his discipline. If a dollar might matter to a future accountant, make sure it can be explained. If it can't, don't put it near a ledger you don't control. That simple approach is why he left so little paper for prosecutors to wave in front of jurors. Las Vegas offered a lawful front door and a back hallway built for abuse. Chicago's path there often ran through union pension loans, money from the Teamsters Central States Fund that underwrote hotel and casino projects. The deal was legal on paper, shady in practice. Decision-makers leaned toward borrowers who played ball, and the outfit expected a stream of profit routed past official counts. Managers with safe hands oversaw counting rooms. Another set of hands, led in the 1,970 seconds by Tony Spilotro, kept pressure on satellites, independent earners, fences, and burglars, so their work didn't interfere with casino interests. When the FBI and U.S. attorneys finally broke that world open in the early 1,980 seconds with the strawman cases, they did it with wiretaps that caught Midwestern bosses discussing skim percentages and casino oversight. Joey Aiuppa and John Cerrone went away for long stretches. Accardo, who had avoided official positions and airport cameras, remained the senior figure outside a courtroom, guiding yet another reshuffle. Spilotro's arc showed the costs of ignoring Accardo's rules. Nevada blacklisted Spilotro from casinos. His side crew, the one locals dubbed the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, committed flashy burglaries that ended in a highly publicized bust. In 1982, a casino executive with Chicago ties survived a car bomb that made national news. Each headline cut against Accardo's policy of keeping the desert quiet. Authorities later said the chaos in Nevada helped seal Spilotro's fate. In 1986, he and his brother vanished and were found dead. Years later, during the Operation Family Secrets trial, an insider told jurors that leadership had approved the murders and that the deaths were meant to restore order. The testimony landed long after Accardo himself had died, and it did not place him at any scene. It confirmed what agents had long believed. Chicago ran on authorization, not impulse. His most personal lesson about exposure came in 1978, when burglars ransacked his River Forest home while he vacationed in warmer weather. The city buzzed. He said nothing. In the months that followed, several suspected members of the burglary crew were killed in separate incidents. The pattern looked like deliberate retaliation. No case ever touched him. No indictment named him for those acts. Much later, court testimony described a leadership order for payback. True or not, the story hardened into cautionary folklore for anyone thinking about crossing the line from profit to insult. Accardo let the message circulate without adding a word. The front businesses he favored deserve attention because they served two purposes. They produced cash you could count and taxes you could pay. They also put outfit men in places where decisions were made. If your company hauled trash for a town, you knew who signed contracts. If your trucks delivered linens to hospitals, you met supervisors who controlled purchasing. If your vending machines filled taverns, you visited bars every week and got early warnings about raids. These outfits looked ordinary. Their advantage was access. People paid for reliability, and reliability came with a price that included wardroom introductions, insurance against union headaches, and a community of vendors who discouraged competitors with quiet phone calls. Loan operations also wore polite masks. The sales pitch sounded like a solution for someone a bank wouldn't touch. Missed payments turned a favor into a demand. Collectors were told to keep exchanges civil, to visit workplaces rather than porches, to avoid anything a neighbor could describe in a complaint. That restraint wasn't kindness. It was cost control. No stories, no witnesses, no excuse for a task. Forced to form. Union power remained a cornerstone. The outfit treated locals like switches that could turn productivity on or off. Accardo trusted diplomats Murray Humphreys in earlier decades, Gus Alex later to arrange peace for a price. A truck line that paid found smoother routes. A construction site that cooperated avoided delays. A promoter who booked a convention learned which locals could complicate staffing and how to prevent that complication with a check written to a consultant. Prosecutors called it racketeering. Defendants called it labor relations. Either way, the money moved. And it moved according to calendars Accardo insisted on. He organized the enterprise like a conservative firm. Disputes were handled through sit-downs that looked like arbitration. Revenues had budgets. When a field leader went to prison, a caretaker took over immediately. The names changed. Sam Battaglia after Giancana. Felix Aldericio after Battaglia. Aiuppa and Cerrone later. Joseph Ferriola in the mid-980 seconds. Sam Carlisi at the turn into the 1,990 seconds. The center did not. Accardo stayed available for approvals and vetoes even as he aged into quieter routines, morning mass, golf, or fishing when he could, lunch at the same table every week. He did not advertise control. He practiced it by making the next decision seem obvious to the men around him. Law enforcement adapted with him. The FBI's top hoodlum program in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds placed his photo on a lot of bulletin boards. Local crime commissions produced org charts that began with his name. Civil suits attempted to push him out of union spheres by painting him as a silent partner. He beat most of it by being boring. Surveillance produced hours of nothing errands, greetings, short meals. Grand juries heard his name but rarely got his voice, because he relied on rights he understood and lawyers who knew the drill. Even when agents built strong cases against his public lieutenants, he structured things so that the fall did not collapse the whole. He also had a habit that earned him time no one else gained. He paid attention to reforms. After judges and lawyers fell during Operation Greylord, he behaved as if every courthouse could be a staging area for a federal sting. After headlines about bribed inspectors and first ward deals, he put more distance between the outfit and politicians who loved recognition. After Alan Dorfman's murder and the tightening oversight over the Teamsters Fund, he treated big loans as magnets for federal attention and leaned harder on homegrown businesses that drew fewer headlines. Each shift made him look passive to onlookers. To insiders, it made him enduring. His early record shows how far he traveled without moving much in public. Police reports from the 1,920 seconds list a teenager and then a young man who caught disorderly or weapons charges, a suspect who didn't talk, a driver whose real value lay in not being noticed. By the late 1,930 seconds, he was a crew leader trusted with gambling and collections. In the 1,940 seconds, he became the day-to-day boss who answered to Ricca. In the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, he evolved into a chairman who let others take titles and arrests while he kept policy steady. Through each stage, the crimes tied to his enterprise stayed consistent. Illegal gambling in many forms, extortion disguised as labor services, bribery that greased licenses and inspections, high-interest loans enforced by pressure, quiet slices of service companies that won public business, and, at times, approval for lethal discipline that removed risks when someone threatened revenue or drew unbearable heat. He treated each of those acts as part of a system that had to function without collapsing under its own weight. Even after his funeral, courts continued to assemble the mosaic. Operation Family Secrets, in the mid-2000s, produced testimony about decades of outfit killings and enforcement policies that witnesses linked back to leadership votes and house rules. Jurors heard the phrase "from the top" and knew what it meant, even if the man at the top had died years earlier. For historians and residents, those trials confirmed what had long been whispered. Accardo's genius was not magic, it was method. He trained a criminal organization to behave like a conservative business, to spread risk, to avoid noise, to treat law enforcement as a permanent condition rather than a temporary storm. The city lived with the result: fewer public explosions, more quiet pressure, a cross-current of corruption that touched workplaces and storefronts that never thought of themselves as part of any underworld. That is the truth of his legacy. He did not invent Chicago's shadow economy. He refined it. He pulled it out of the era of roaring cars and pushed it into a time of invoices, middlemen, and patient scheduling. The harm never disappeared. It changed shape. Debtors still lost sleep. Small business owners still paid for help they didn't want. Workers saw contracts tilted by hands they never elected. The man who oversaw that system preferred a life that looked ordinary: church, lunch, family, fishing, because ordinary made him invisible. He did not outtalk enemies. He outlasted them by never letting anyone see him hurry. He trained the men around him to treat memory as a ledger and routine as law. Nothing written that didn't need to be. No names on a phone. If a meeting could be handled by a walk around the block, that's how it went. He liked appointments that began on time and ended before anyone refilled a glass. He wanted every collector to know the route by heart, and every route captain to keep totals in his head until the envelope changed hands. The tone was firm but never theatrical. He corrected people in a sentence. If someone pushed back, he reminded them of the rule that had kept him free since the 1,920 seconds: attention costs money. He preferred compartmentalization. The outfit functioned like a set of rooms rather than an open hall. A gambling team knew its betters, not the lone crew's accounts. A labor contact handled one industry while another focused on a different union. Front businesses had managers who believed in customer service and kept invoices straight. A few times each week, a small group, the same faces for years, met in quiet corners to settle disagreements, set percentages, approve promotions, and calm tempers. They discussed money, not folklore. A bookmaker, who failed to pay a winning bettor, lost his seat. A collector, who bullied needlessly, lost a route. The goal was longevity, and longevity depended on a steady rhythm that looked like ordinary life from the sidewalk. The neighborhood map shifted over time, but the logic never did. Cicero kept its reputation as the cash register, vending routes, taverns, card rooms that drifted from address to address. Suburban phone banks handled sports bets, switching locations every few months so a warrant would land on an empty table. Out west, small towns appreciated the business a new machine distributor could bring. Up north, union halls learned that peace had a number you could call. Downtown, a discreet lunch could deliver the same result as a rally, a permit, a signature, a delay avoided. None of it worked without an echo of the same sentence in people's heads. Keep it quiet. Keep it moving. Politics flowed into that map as naturally as traffic. Chicago's old First Ward, a place where favors traveled in low voices, linked businessmen, judges, lawyers, and ward fixers for decades. When law enforcement finally turned those rooms inside out with microphones and cooperators, the public got to hear how a request moved through the city's machinery. A case delayed here, a zoning matter corrected there, a license approved after a call. For years, those channels had buffered the outfit's interests, and Accardo rarely had to show up in person to benefit. He invested in relationships that could be accessed without exposing the core. When the First Ward's protectors faced charges, he didn't panic. He had expected the day, and had already built alternate routes through service companies and friends who did not crave attention. Labor clout remained a dependable instrument. The building trades, trucking, hotel, and restaurant locals each offered leverage points that could be calibrated like dials. He discouraged threats you could quote, and encouraged language that sounded like a business plan. A company got a consultant who solved delivery problems. A project hit a snag, then smoothed out after a meeting with the right steward. A promoter learned to schedule around conflicts that suddenly disappeared when he wrote a check to the approved charity or vendor. If someone balked, they discovered how expensive delays could be. Prosecutors later called these patterns extortion and racketeering. He had known from the beginning what they were. He also knew why they lasted. People paid for predictability. Chicago never stopped gambling, so the house never stopped collecting. Lines on pro football spread across the suburbs. College basketball kept phones ringing through winter. Baseball carried spring and summer. The horses filled every day. The operation operated like a responsible bank. Credit extended to known bettors. Limits respected. Losses collected on schedule. Wins paid to maintain trust. List makers trimmed customer lists when a voice sounded wrong or asked rookie questions. Operators moved offices before a pattern formed. Arrests came with the job. Fines were treated like license fees. What mattered was that the ledger kept balancing, week after week, without creating the kind of chaos that put a floodlight on the whole building. Loans followed the same script. A man who couldn't get a bank line found help with a handshake and tough terms. The first missed payment brought a polite reminder. The second brought a sit-down with a firmer tone. The third meant the account became a priority until it was current. No scenes, no shouting on porches. Collectors showed up at workplaces where conversations stayed short and plain. The method wasn't kindness. It was cost control, designed to deny police the spectacle that justifies task forces and budgets. Over time, the euphemisms, help, accommodation, bridge money, sounded so normal that people forgot the fear behind them until a deadline approached. He insisted on a firm line about narcotics. His order was not born of moral outrage. It was a reading of risk. Drug cases triggered heavy sentences, relentless agents, and frightened defendants eager to talk. He told his people to stay with the old reliables. Games, sports books, machines, labor leverage, and service firms that looked ordinary. Individuals broke that rule over the years. He dealt with those cases as threats to the system, not as debates about vice. The point was mathematical. If you ran a business that drew fewer manhunts, you went home to your family at night. The most public tests of his approach came in bursts. The Hollywood shakedown cases in the early 1940s dragged top men into court and put one under a headstone. He stepped in to run the day-to-day and made the machine hum again without headlines. The Kefauver hearings forced him to learn television etiquette, arrive early, dress well, say little. The 1,960 tax conviction and 1,962 reversal taught him to let the numbers on paper tell a legal story a judge could accept. Appalachian taught him never to attend national gatherings. The Giancana drama taught him to choose front men, who understood that columnists are a hazard. The 1,978 burglary at his home taught him that even a private address could pull the city into his living room if he didn't reassert boundaries. The Las Vegas skimming prosecutions taught him how far microphones could reach and how dangerous an airport photograph could be. Each event refined rather than reshaped his habits. Las Vegas deserves another look because it shows how he preferred to exercise power indirectly, with expectations instead of slogans. Money reached casinos through loans and partners who looked legal on paper. The return allegedly reached Chicago through couriers and decisions made in counting rooms by men who understood that the official ledger was not the only ledger. Kansas City wiretaps, Cleveland and Milwaukee connections, federal teams in Nevada, and the Strawman indictments in the 1,980 seconds pulled that world into daylight. Public bosses Ayupa, Cerrone, and others took the fall in 1986 after juries heard tapes and saw documents. He stayed home, let younger officers absorb the blast, and reshuffled management so the payroll did not implode. It was the clearest proof of how he arranged distance between himself and the cash. The desert also revealed the hazard of ignoring his rule against spectacle. Tony Spilotro had been sent to keep fringe earners from interfering with casino interests. Instead, headlines multiplied blacklisting, a burglary crew with a nickname, a high-profile bomb that didn't kill its target but did light up every newsroom. By 1986, the Nevada chapter ended in the kind of grim resolution Chicago had always kept inside the walls. Years later, Family Secret's testimony told jurors that leadership had approved the decision to remove Spilotro. The account echoed what agents had suspected, and it matched Accardo's lifelong habit of resolving risks without speeches. Closer to home, he spread income across legal fronts because paper shields mattered. Waste hauling contracts explained trucks and payrolls. Linen and uniform services justified warehouses and invoices. Food distributors visited kitchens and loading docks with clipboards and schedules. These companies filled tax returns with entries that satisfied auditors and showed neighbors that a man paid his dues like anyone else. They also provided a daily presence in places where information traveled early and quietly. Town halls, purchasing offices, permit counters, and warehouses where a supervisor could use a friend. He treated the courts as part of the landscape. After Operation Greylord exposed crooked judges and lawyers in the 1,980 seconds, he operated as if every corridor could hide a microphone. After the first ward investigations brought down political guarantors, he trimmed reliance on promises from public figures who loved newspaper ink. After the Teamsters' pension leadership changed and oversight hardened, he pulled back from loans that brought national scrutiny. None of these shifts were dramatic from the outside. Inside, they felt decisive. He was always moving a step to the side to avoid the next predictable blow. A quiet day with him in the 1,980 seconds or early 1,990 seconds would have bored a novelist and taught a student. He woke early, read the sports pages, made a few calls from safe phones, and met one or two people for lunch in the same restaurant he had been using for years. He asked short questions. Is it on time? Who's handling it? Any complaints? He listened more than he talked. He left before dessert and took the same route home. Neighbors saw a grandfather in a good suit. Agents saw a man who refused to give them a scene. The men who worked for him saw a schedule they were expected to match. The catalog of crimes that swirled around his name remained consistent over 6 decades, and prosecutors, commissions, and later witnesses filled in the details. Illegal gambling across sports and cards, the neighborhood lottery that evolved into a centralized numbers game, slot machines, and Later video poker placed where the law looked the other way. Extortion masked as consulting fees. And labor. Peace. High-interest loans collected through quiet pressure. Bribery and influence, aimed at inspections, licensing, and zoning. Strategic participation in waste hauling, linen, and supply companies that won public contracts. Interstate coordination to extract unreported percentages from casinos. And, at times, approval for lethal reprisals when exposure or betrayal threatened the balance. He kept himself insulated from the point of contact in each category. Others rolled dice, counted bets, negotiated contracts, delivered envelopes, and took the ride when a case was made. He managed outcomes. He rarely spoke about why he did things the way he did, but his choices reveal his thinking. He believed that public drama destroys markets. He believed that order is cheaper than chaos. He believed that a reputation for fairness inside criminal lines pay winners. Warn before you act. Be consistent. Reduce the kind of grudges that erupt into feuds. He believed that law enforcement never stops. So the only rational response is to live as if you're always being watched. He believed that a leader's power grows when he speaks less and corrects gently but conclusively. These beliefs turned his world from a carnival of stunts into a bureaucracy of earnings. Long after his burial, the city kept discovering traces of the system he shaped. Family secrets put old murders in front of jurors and attached authorization to bosses by name. Trials of First Ward figures and fixers showed how phone calls could bend public processes. RICO cases mapped gambling routes and loan operations like transit lines. Each proceeding confirmed that the outfit he left behind functioned without needing a celebrity at the top. That was his final lesson to the men who followed him. Build so that one public loss doesn't topple the house. The structure outlived him because it was designed to. His story rests in a paradox that explains his endurance. He oversaw a network that harmed people in quiet ways through debt, fear, and tilted choices. And he did it while projecting the manners of a suburban retiree who liked golf and a good lunch. He built a criminal enterprise that hid under clerical habits. Calendars, memos of the mind, receipts from service firms, and meetings that never grew loud. The absence of drama was the drama. That is why cameras rarely caught him doing anything but walking to a car. That is why jurors seldom heard his voice. That is why his name still stands as a symbol of control, without spectacle. What remains, even after the documents and testimonies and obituaries, is the outline of a method that turned Chicago's underworld from a storm into a climate. Rules replaced impulses. Schedules replaced adventures. Profit replaced pride. The city adjusted around that weight, and people adjusted around the city. He taught men to make money in the dark without tripping the lights, and he kept teaching it until age took him off the field. The last chapter of his life does not change the early ones, it explains them. He believed that if you learned to ignore applause, you could hear the sound of money moving, and if you kept that sound steady, you could live long enough to see your students teach their own. The city kept his rhythms long after he was gone. Restaurants where he had favored a corner table kept the pace he liked, orders fast, checks settled without fuss, hellos exchanged in low tones. Investigators who had spent years watching him still drove past those places out of habit. They remembered the way he carried himself, the way a conversation with him felt like a review of a ledger. Calm, exact, no wasted words. His influence lingered not as a legend told in excited voices, but as a set of habits people followed because the habits worked. A collector who kept appointments, a bookmaker who paid wins promptly, a steward who made schedules run on time. Those were the products of his style. He had redesigned the culture by insisting that predictability outruns bravado. He didn't start with that power. He started as a kid who left school early and learned the city by walking it. The near West Side taught him where money changed hands, which doors mattered, which corners belonged to which crew. From small tasks, driving, watching, passing a message, he learned the value of reliability. Prohibition's chaos gave him a graduate course. Speakeasies, routes, payoffs, quiet garages, late returns before sunrise, he absorbed it all without demanding attention. When Al Capone lit every headline, Accardo stayed a step back, gaining trust by avoiding foolish risks. Stories later credited Capone with giving him the Joe Batters nickname after a particularly brutal assignment. Reporters repeated it for decades. though the details lived mostly as lore. The nickname stuck because it fit a perception. He finished jobs and said nothing. When Prohibition ended, he followed money where the law left gaps. The lottery, known as policy, remained a daily tide in neighborhoods the city neglected. Slot machines migrated from city bars to suburban rooms. Private card games thrived behind storefronts. Bookmakers took phone calls tied to ball games and horse tracks. Collections ran on a schedule. He advanced by making that schedule work like clockwork, and by learning which public officials preferred predictability to chaos. He invested in fronts that looked like regular businesses: coin-op distributors, vending service, restaurants, supply houses. Those firms produced tax returns and invoices, the camouflage he prized. The Hollywood extortion scandal in the early 1940s changed his life. Studio bosses faced shakedowns through union leaders Willie Byoff and George Brown. Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, and other seniors were pulled into the case. Nitti ended his life rather than face court. Ricca did time. That vacuum put Accardo in operational control under Ricca's advice. He reorganized the outfit into tiers: lieutenants who ran crews, area supervisors who balanced books, a small board that arbitrated disputes. Meetings shortened, routines hardened. The city's underworld stepped away from spectacles that had burned it during Prohibition. He wanted a long run with steady returns, not another explosion that exacted political costs. Television brought the next test. The Kefauver hearings taught Americans to recognize the calm faces behind rackets. He met subpoenas with a suit and silence, invoking rights while answering identification questions politely. Cameras got his image. They didn't get his story. Back home, he expanded buffers, placed front men with clean records, and made sure the paper trails that described his lifestyle could survive a tax agent's curiosity. That caution paid off when a lady 1950 tax case resulted in a conviction that an appeals court overturned in 1962 for shaky math. He absorbed the lesson: if a number might end up in court, make sure it tells a harmless tale. Appalachian in 1957 delivered another warning. Police stumbled onto a national gathering in upstate New York, took names, and confirmed in one afternoon what locals had hinted at for years. A national network existed. He didn't make those trips. He believed in phones, brief meals, and a small circle. Even so, the aftershocks tightened federal focus. He responded by pushing a younger, public boss forward. First Sam Giancana, later Sam Battaglia and others, while he and Ricca kept strategy steady. When Giancana's profile exploded, bringing gossip columns and federal heat, Accardo let the spotlight fall where it wanted and corrected the course from a quiet distance. Giancana's contempt case, exile in Mexico, return under orders, and 1,975 death created headlines that still echo. Law enforcement believed it was an internal cleanup to silence a man who had attracted too much attention. No case reached Accardo. He made no public comment and guided the next handoff with the same preference for managers over showmen. His reach into labor power made him valuable to allies and dangerous to opponents. Freight, building trades, hotels, restaurants, each sector offered levers. He preferred contracts and consulting to threats you could quote. A company that paid the right fee received peace. One that didn't saw delays, shortages, or staffing issues. Prosecutors called it extortion built on fear of disruption. He called it service with a price. He kept those relationships separate from gambling so a raid on one floor didn't shut down the whole building. Bookmaking never slowed. The map stretched across seasons. Football in fall, basketball in winter, baseball in spring and summer, horses year-round. Phone rooms shifted often to outrun wiretap warrants. Better lists were pruned to avoid talkative clients. Limits kept risk tolerable. Fines for minor arrests were treated as operating costs. Credit was a tool, not a toy, and collections used polite pressure to keep police out of living rooms. The system traded on trust. Pay winners, roll over losses into structured notes, keep the ledger clean. Loan operations ran on the same idea. A handshake filled the gap a bank wouldn't. Interest punished delays. Collectors visited workplaces to avoid scenes. The language softened the reality. Help. Bridge. Accommodation. but the power behind it rested on fear of consequences. He insisted on restraint to reduce fallout. That restraint minimized visible harm, not actual pressure. The difference mattered to people living it, even if it earned him time free of a cell. 2 rules stood above all: avoid narcotics and avoid spectacle. He pushed earners toward gambling, collections, union clout, and service companies because those ventures drew less relentless pursuit. Younger men tempted by fast drug profits learned that his ban wasn't moral preaching, it was survival math. Cases tied to drugs triggered heavier sentences and more cooperators. He dealt with breaches as threats to the system's health. Las Vegas extended his reach. Loans through friendly channels, including Teamsters pension money in key years, helped build hotels and casinos. The outfit expected a stream that never appeared on official ledgers. Skilled men managed counting rooms. Tony Accardo enforced discipline among side earners who could interfere with casino money. Federal probes in the late 1970s and early 1980s cracked that arrangement. Kansas City wiretaps recorded talk about skim percentages. The Strawman cases led to 1,986 convictions for public bosses like Joey Aiuppa and John Cerrone. Accardo didn't take a seat in that courtroom. He had stayed distant, allowing him to supervise another reshuffle at home. Nevada also showcased the danger of ignoring his law against publicity. Spilotro's blacklisting, a burglary crew that earned a nickname, and a car bomb targeting a casino figure in 1982 drew national attention. Chicago hated attention. In 1986, Spilotro and his brother were found dead after disappearing. Years later, witnesses during Operation Family Secrets told jurors that leadership had approved the killings to restore order. The testimony arrived long after Accardo had died and did not place him at any scene. It matched the government's view that Chicago acted by authorization rather than impulse. A more intimate breach hit him in 1978, when burglars ripped through his River Forest home while he vacationed. The violation pierced the armor he had built around privacy. In the months after, several men rumored to be involved in the break-in were slain in separate incidents. Reporters, detectives, and later a cooperating witness tied those killings to an order from above. No jury ever heard a case against him for those acts. He declined to explain and returned to routine. The streets absorbed the lesson. Certain lines, once crossed, carried consequences even if no one talked about them. The 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds brought legal storms to people around him. Gus Alex, the longtime diplomat between outfit interests and civic fixers, was convicted in 1,992 inches, a case that outlined years of extortion tied to labor threats. Sam Carlisi, who had taken over day-to-day leadership after Joseph Ferriola's death, later faced a sweeping racketeering case describing gambling operations and loans. The First Ward machinery, which for decades had made introductions and eased paperwork, met its own reckoning through wiretaps and informers. Operation Greylord had already exposed corrupt judges and lawyers in Cook County's courts. These events confirmed what Accardo had planned for. Guarantees disappear. Design must endure. He leaned on legal fronts even harder in those years. Waste hauling firms secured municipal contracts. Linen and uniform companies supplied hospitals and hotels. Food distributors serviced kitchens. Those firms wrote invoices, filed taxes, and gave cover for a comfortable lifestyle. They also put outfit men in daily contact with decision-makers in public offices and purchasing departments. Access mattered as much as revenue. It allowed problems to be anticipated rather than responded to, which fit his taste for prevention over cleanup. As age advanced, his days narrowed. He moved to a quieter suburb, kept to church, family, short lunches, and early rides home. The FBI's top hoodlum program still had his photo on walls, and agents kept a predictable watch. He gave them little. He showed up when called, answered the basic questions, invoked rights for the rest, and left. He paid some fines and beat larger cases with patience and counsel. His record in court remained thin compared to the scope of what prosecutors, crime commissions, and later witnesses attributed to him. Illegal gambling in many forms. Extortion dressed as labor peace and consulting. Bribery for licensing and inspections. High-interest loans enforced with pressure. Infiltration of service firms that won public business. coordination with out-of-state casino operators to skim profits before they reached ledgers, and, on occasion, approval for lethal discipline when exposure or betrayal threatened revenue. He did not boast about any of it. He avoided paper, avoided microphones, avoided scenes. He died at home in 1992 of natural causes, 86 years old, buried in Hillside after a quiet church service. News crews noted how rare it was for a figure with his reputation to reach such an age without a long prison term. Obituaries repeated, "Big Tuna," the nickname born from a photo of a massive catch on a fishing trip years earlier. Friends and critics agreed on one point. He had reshaped Chicago's underworld by trading theatrics for order. The organization, stripped of its celebrities, began to look like a cautious company. History kept writing footnotes after he was gone. Family Secrets in 2007 presented jurors with a narrative of killings, sit-downs, and authorization that spanned decades, linking decisions to a structure that survived leaders. First Ward cases explained how influence had moved through the city's political machinery. RICO cases mapped gambling and loan routes with the precision of a transit map. Those proceedings did not invent his legacy. They clarified it. They showed how a method, routine, restraint layers could keep a machine running while exposing as little as possible at any given moment. His life does not fit a romantic arc. It is an account of choices that produced influence and a long run at the top of a criminal enterprise. Those choices harmed many people in quiet ways. Debtors who could not breathe beneath impossible interest. Small merchants who paid for peace because refusing carried a price. Workers whose contracts were shaped by unseen hands. He knew that cost and chose control anyway. He believed the safest way to run such a system was to make it boring from the outside schedules. Careful words, clean shirts, lunch at noon, home by evening. He didn't outrun the law. He outlasted it by limiting the number of chances it had to catch him doing anything provable. Walk the city with his story in mind, and you can still spot the pattern he left behind. A tavern that always felt safe because someone made sure rowdy customers went elsewhere. A hauling contract that never seemed to change hands. A union hall where negotiations ended quickly when the right person appeared. A restaurant where a corner table stayed unreserved at lunchtime for a man in a good suit who never raised his voice. None of those scenes alone prove anything. Together, they describe a climate. He helped create that climate and taught others to maintain it with a smile and a schedule. The boy who left school learned to count in a city that measured itself in paydays. He stepped into rooms where silence bought time. He built a method that turned chaos into routine and noise into a liability. He attached his name to very little and his will to everything that mattered. He lived long. He ended where he had always wanted to be, at home, with family, after a day that looked like any other to people passing on the street. Behind that ordinariness lay an enterprise that reached into kitchens, loading docks, card rooms, counting rooms, and political offices. That reach did not announce itself. It hummed. He had tuned it for decades and left it running, quiet enough to pass for background, loud enough for anyone close enough to hear the numbers. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Tony Accardo here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through patience, discipline, and silent authority. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.